Welcome to Witch Hunt. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack.
Today, we're excited to bring you something really special, a meeting of minds across the Atlantic with our friends from the Witches of Scotland podcast.
As fellow advocates working to honor witch trial victims and prevent modern-day witch hunts, getting to talk with Claire Mitchell and Zoe Venditozzi was incredible. They've been such an inspiration to our work.
That's right. While we were working on Connecticut's witch trial exonerations, seeing their campaign for justice in Scotland showed us what was possible. Now we get to compare notes on everything from historical research to current advocacy.
And for any Witches of Scotland listeners joining us for the first time, welcome. We're thrilled to have you here. You'll discover we share many of the same passions as Claire and Zoe when it comes to righting historical wrongs and preventing witch hunts today.
So settle in for a fascinating conversation that spans centuries and continents as we explore witch trial history and justice with our Scottish counterparts.
Hello and welcome to this extremely special episode of it's a collaboration between us and another podcast from the other side of the pond. So for those of you that know me, I'm Zoe Venditozzi from the Witches of Scotland podcast. We are a podcast based inevitably in Scotland where we talk about the witches that were accused here and then link that to worldwide efforts, which is where our collab comes in tonight. So hello to those of you that know me through the Witches of Scotland podcast, and I'm going to hand over to the other half of this.
Hi. Hello from Witch Hunt. I'm Josh Hutchinson, and I'm here with Sarah Jack, my co-host, and we're an American podcast that covers witch trial history and also talks about modern day witch hunts.
It's so cool because we know of each other obviously through Twitter and we've listened to each other's podcasts, and it's really nice I was saying at the beginning, to meet you. Of course, we're not actually sadly in the same room. We're all in different places in Scotland and in the States, but it's nice to meet you. Hello.
Hello.
It is so special to be here with you. Thank you so much.
Oh no, thank you, because it's difficult finding time and obviously the time difference and all the rest of it. So I'm really glad that we could make it work. Can you tell our listeners, your listeners will know this already, but can you tell our listeners what the genesis of your project was and what the form of it is these days?
Our project began as a way to promote the Connecticut Witch Trial Exoneration Project. We were looking to clear the names of those who had been accused of witchcraft in colonial Connecticut, and we devised the podcast to spread the word about that. But since then, it's evolved. We've expanded our coverage to global witch hunts around the world at different periods in time. And we've really been dialed in lately on what's called harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks, which are basically modern day attacks on people accused of witchcraft.
It's broad because you're a few different things then, aren't you? So you're like us, you're a campaign plus a podcast. So what are your backgrounds?
I'm a descendant of Rebecca Nurse, who was hanged in Salem, and also her sister Mary Esty, their grandchildren married. And so I had that little understanding of witch trials for a while. And as I kept working on my family history research as a hobby, I found that I descended from an accused witch in Connecticut, and I wanted to know more. It was really hard to find information about the Connecticut witch trials. I didn't have my nose in a book like I should have, but I was just online checking out what was there, and there was no memorial. So I started looking for the other people that were talking about the American colony witch hunts and trying to understand how does it fit in with what happened in Salem. And so the Exoneration project came out of a group of us coming together, trying to find out what can we do to move things forward in Connecticut for an apology. And Josh has a long social media history with witch trial work, and he came on board and was a huge help. And that is when the podcast was launched.
It's wild to me and to Claire that you're able to trace yourself back to the nurse story, because in Scotland we can't really do that. There isn't the chain of the way that you're so much more organized in America, presumably because it was quite a new thing, so people were recording everything as they went, whereas in Scotland some stuff exists, but it's very hard to prove. So sometimes people will say, oh, I'm descended to such and such. And you're like, you might be. Like, you've got the same name and your family comes from the area, but you can't prove it conclusively. But we know that you can in the States, which is just mind-blowing to me. We often give talks where we'll say to people, the chances are, if your family are generations way, way back in Scotland, you may very well be related, because there's only about 1 million people in Scotland at that point. Or more likely, you're probably related to somebody who was involved in accusing or executing somebody that was accused in Scotland. And I think that gives us pause for thought, but it's hard to prove. So for you to have that direct link, to me, is just like mind-blowing. And not to just one accused, but then another as well in a different location. It's mental to me.
Josh has even more than I do.
Oh, Josh, please tell.
Okay. My story with Charles goes back to when I was in high school. One summer, I did a trip with my family to Massachusetts, and my grandfather was from a town called Danvers, which used to be Salem Village. So that was the epicenter. And we went to the Rebecca Nurse homestead, and there's a monument to people who signed a petition in defense of Rebecca. And my ancestor, Joseph Hutchinson, is on there. And the way that they wrote it was JOS''H. So it practically said Josh. And it always stuck with me. So I went home.
I just got shivers down my back there, Josh. Genuinely, that's so weird.
It was such an experience. But I later found out that I'm descended from Rebecca Nurse's sister, Mary Esty, and also several dozen people who were involved on either side. As you said, you're more likely to be related to somebody who was an accuser because they outnumbered the defendants usually.
Interestingly, I have a theory. I don't know if it has any basis. Let me tell you what.
Please come out with a wild theory. I will.
I'll just, but it's good we've got these experts here. I have a theory that one of the reasons that people are remembered and that you've been able to go down the generations is because it wasn't that long after people had been accused that the chat about exoneration started. And therefore people had that recognition and agency. So it was my family member was wrongly accused and convicted, or my family member, unfortunately, the few people who were executed. And therefore that passes down the generations as something that you recall happening in your family. Whereas in Scotland, there wasn't that acceptance there'd been a miscarriage of justice, and there wasn't that, as it were, almost public vindication. Do you think that's maybe a reason why you guys do remember your ancestors better than we do?
That is definitely a reason why we remember our Salem ancestors, because 10 years after the trials, everybody submitted petitions to have their attainders reversed and their names cleared and to receive some sort of restitution payments. The effort to get the restitution took another decade. So it just kept perpetuating. And then around the revolution, and he's not related to me, but Governor Thomas Hutchinson in the 1760s wrote a history of Massachusetts and had a very long chapter about Salem. So it's just was passed down generation to generation.
It's just so different to Scotland. And I think some of that is because Scotland, it was over a couple of 100 years. The numbers were obviously much, much bigger. And I think that there was a certain amount of stigma, obviously, for people that were accused. You naturally would expect that. But then I think that there must have been shame driving a lot of the people that were involved in the accusations as well, that just then wanted just to forget about it. But we have spoken to some experts that have said that, so in some areas of Fife, which is where I live, Fife to me is a big county. To you, it'd be just like a neighborhood. You'd be like, you would drive there to go and pick up takeout or something. Do you know what I mean? You'd be like, it's nothing. Distance is nothing in the States. I know that because some of my family are American. And I know that they'll drive 2 hours to go out for dinner, whereas we'd be like, oh, you'd need a hotel if you were going to go there. That's quite serious as never. But Fife is, to me, quite big. So to you, if you look at the map, you'll be like, that's nothing. That's just a tiny little county area. But Fife has got lots of little villages, and Fife was very involved in witchcraft accusations and witch hunts. And we talked to some experts that said that some of those villages, but to have retained families that have been there for hundreds of years, there's still a fear in some parts of the community. And I'm not talking necessarily about the young ones now, and obviously not people that have moved in, but people that are many generations long families, that there is maybe still an idea from some people, which, I mean, I don't know if that's true or if that just makes a good kind of tourism story, but I think that there is something where that they don't want to discuss it, that it's been put to rest. And I do know that when they were looking at doing a memorial down in the bottom of Fife in a place called Couris in Torryburn, that a lot of locals were not keen for memorial, apparently, we were told by campaigners, because they were just kind of like, leave the past. That's terrible. We don't want to talk about that. But I think that you guys are very much on the same page as us, which is you have to talk about the bad stuff in history. You can't just pretend it didn't happen. You need to bring it out into the light. And that's no more obvious than what the recent interviews that you've been doing about what's happening in other countries. So it's still obviously an issue, it's still a problem. Have you been shocked to discover what's happening in the modern day?
We were a bit shocked when we first learned about it. After we had started Witch Hunt, a gentleman named Damon Leff from South Africa, he runs a campaign against witch hunting, and he contacted us, and that's when we first started to learn about it. And very quickly, we learned how large of a problem it is. The United Nations put out a report that they have reports from at least 60 nations and involving tens of thousands of individuals. So it's very epic in scope. And it was a surprise to learn just how widespread it is. It's every continent has it.
And do you find in Scotland, it was round about 85% of the accused were women. Is it similarly gendered with the people you've spoken to in different countries?
It's very gendered with most of the people that we've spoken with. There are some pockets, I believe, in Papua New Guinea, where men are considered to be sorcerers. But as a rule, it's generally 80 to 90%. We talked to a gentleman from India who said 97% were women, and the 3% men were related to the women. They were supporters of them, and that's how they got caught up in it.
Which is similar to what happened in Scotland. Often the men were husbands or sons or brothers or whatever, or friends or neighbours. They're just in the wrong place at the wrong time sort of thing. It's wild that, isn't it? Because we focused a lot on different African countries because of Leo Igwe, who obviously runs advocacy for accused witches out in Africa. And we were talking to him the other night. We did a Zoom with him from Nigeria. And it doesn't seem to be something that's abating. It just seems to be something that seems to be getting worse, if anything.
You have multiple reasons for that. There's climate change that's driving some accusations because of all the weather events that are happening. There's more droughts, there's more heavy storms that destroy crops. And when people are desperate, that's when they start pointing fingers at people for witchcraft. So you have that, you have things like the refugee crisis and migration that are carrying beliefs.
Yeah. And how do you find people in the States have taken to your efforts around Connecticut? Have people been interested, or do they think it should be left in the past, or are people quite engaged with it?
I would say my experience with Connecticut is they're timid about looking at that history. I think about how the Salem executions were like really towards the end. Many of those who were executed probably didn't expect to be. That's a real different history than in Connecticut. It was a pretty high execution rate. And it was just...
Sorry to interrupt, but can you tell us what happened in Connecticut? Can you give us a potted history, just in case people haven't listened to in your podcast yet?
Right. In Connecticut, the first hanging was in 1647. A woman named Alice Young was executed, and she was the first of anyone in the American colonies to be hanged for witchcraft. And I emphasize hanged, not burned. The colonies here did hangings. But she was the first. And then within several years after that, 6 more individuals were accused, and they were 100% convicted and executed. So Connecticut was 7 for 7 starting out at the gate. And then things kind of moderated in the 1650s, but then you had a Hartford witch panic in 1662 and 1663, where another 4 individuals were hanged. So you had 11 individuals total hanged in Connecticut in about a 16-year time period, where Massachusetts in that time period only executed 4 people. So it was worse to be in Connecticut.
And was Connecticut a very big population at that point? I mean, surely there weren't that many people living there.
The towns at the time, the biggest towns might have had a couple thousand people, but most of the towns were just a couple hundred people. So it wasn't very big. And Salem wasn't very big. Salem Village was 525 people or so. But, 156 people end up being accused. So.
Hang on, sorry, just to ask you to repeat that. So there was about 525 people lived there and 100 odd people were accused. Do you mean in that town?
No, 156 people.
Jeez, I was like, what?
Sorry, that's the total from all of the Salem, which covered dozens of towns.
Okay.
Yes.
I was like, that's a much bigger story than I realized it was. It was already. Okay. And what do you think of the accusations at that point in Connecticut? What was going on there that these accusations occurred?
There were epidemics that swept through periodically, and women would be blamed for causing those. And there was fear of warfare with the Dutch, who were neighbors, and with the Native Americans. They were constantly in this state of fear. And it was the Little Ice Age, and the weather was terrible. And sometimes the crops didn't come out. So there's a lot of finger pointing about livestock crimes, and crimes involving children were very big reasons for witchcraft accusations.
Now, do you mean crimes involving children falling ill and dying, or children being accused of being witches?
For the most part, it was children who died in Connecticut. I believe the youngest person involved was 13 who was accused. And that's another relative of Sarah, Winifred Benham Jr. But by the time you got to the Salem witch panic, a 4-year-old child was accused of witchcraft and imprisoned in a dungeon. They made special shackles for her to chain her to the wall for 7 months. And she hasn't received any apology. She didn't get restitution. There's been no real acknowledgement. So we also have the Massachusetts Witch Hunt Justice Project going, and we're trying to get an exoneration for everyone who was convicted and an apology to everybody who was ever prosecuted.
Your legal system is obviously different to ours, so we can't get an exoneration. Claire, you can maybe explain that, because people often, I think, have an American filmic idea of what we can get done, but our system is obviously different to yours.
A lot of the time when people are interacting with us on social media, Americans say, you're asking for the wrong thing, you shouldn't get a pardon, because a pardon presupposes they've done something. You're looking for an exoneration. And I say, I wish that we could get that. Our system doesn't allow that. So the best that we can get is a pardon that makes it clear that they accept the basis for it was that they ought never to have been convicted of anything. I'm interested to work out why it was that some people were pardoned, some people weren't. For example, why was the 4-year-old girl, why was she not pardoned?
She was never convicted. She was never pardoned.
That makes sense. Can't you? Of all the people you can't exonerate are people who are never convicted, but you said she also never got any money as well, any compensation. Is that again because it's tied to the conviction?
Yeah.
Okay.
Most of the individuals who received compensation were convicted and jailed, and the ones who received exoneration were the ones who were condemned.
Okay.
So she was released, the 4-year-old, after 7 months of being held. I wonder, I'm a teacher and I work a lot with kids that have had trauma, and I just wonder what impact that had on that wee girl. Like, how could you possibly move on after being held for 7 months and presumably, I'm imagining, treated really badly if they thought she was a witch? I can't imagine they looked after her very carefully, because I know that in Scotland the theory was that once you had become a witch, that you weren't really a human anymore. You were the devil's puppet kind of thing. So that was one of the ways, I think, in which the people that did the accusing and the executions were able to live with what it was they were doing, because they didn't view them as being real people anymore. Was that similar in America?
Yes. And Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old, was also imprisoned with her mother, Sarah Good. And Sarah had an infant who was less than a year old who died in the jail. And Sarah Good herself was executed. So Dorothy grew up without a mother. She had been through all this trauma. She'd been there with her mother, and then her mother's taken away. So it was deeply traumatic. And her father filed a petition later on saying that she was ungovernable, that because of the trauma, she couldn't basically take care of herself.
She will have had the most tremendous PTSD. That there's no way at that age. Oh my goodness. And have you ever had anybody get in touch with you that's descendants that might be a descendant of that little girl?
There are descendants of Sarah Good. There are good descendants. But
Right.
history on Dorothy is still being evaluated, but there has been really interesting recent discoveries on her possible. We might know how things ended for her now. Josh, do you want to talk about that?
We know that Dorothy did end up bearing 2 children, and we don't know who the fathers are for those 2 children. The children were taken away as infants and placed as indentured servants until they grew of age. Dorothy lived without her children. Her father wasn't very good to her. She just had a pretty miserable life, and she ended up being warned out of town, and she would move to another town, and then they'd warn her out, and she may have died alone in a field in Connecticut.
Well, that's so awful. You can really, it's so many hundreds of years ago, but you can really feel that, I think, as a connection to what that'd be like. I've got children, and just the thought of losing a baby, if you were, first of all, being in prison at all, and being in prison with a baby and a 4-year-old, and then losing your infant, and then knowing that you're going to die and that wee girl's going to be left on her own, just can't even get your head around that. So I presume people can really connect with stories like that and think, yeah, I can see the reason why this needs to be brought out into the light, and we need to learn about things like this.
Can I circle back, Sarah, and ask, in light of what we've just heard and how enraging that is and how outrageous, why is it that people are timid in coming forward? Why do you think there's this sort of resistance?
There's a lot of layers to that. One is there's a lot of male history there that they're proud of. Secondly, there's
For the purposes of the podcast, everyone just
was about to do this
and looked and all nodded. Just that doesn't really come across.
Yeah, male history. Yeah.
And then one of the things that really kept coming up with us with the legislation that was getting voted on and moving through the General Assembly was there was still a lot of misunderstanding about what the conviction was for. And there appeared to be a lot of fear around witchcraft still. When testimony was given by descendants asking for the politicians to vote yes to move this bill to the House, one of them demanded that there be proof that the woman who was convicted had not had a covenant with the devil.
I remember that.
Unbelievable.
And I think Claire and I spoke about that on our podcast. And we're just kind of like, are you completely bonkers? We're at a stage now. What was that? Was that 2022 maybe? Or is that 23? Where we were kind of like, we don't believe in witches in that way anymore. That's insane. But I'm sorry to say this, and I am saying this with full knowledge that our government is absolutely appalling. Okay. The Westminster are just dreadful. But we've got so many stories coming out of the States where we're kind of like, and now these Americans have done this crazy thought or this crazy thing's happening. And I think part of it is because America is enormous compared to us. And there's such a huge array of things that go on there. And it's so complex. But when that came out, when I was a kid, you used to get like bits on our news saying things, it was called Only in America. And then there'd be this completely bonkers story and you'd be like, and the Americans did this. And it was one of those Only in America moments. We were like, are you mental? You're a man in today, in the 21st century saying, can you prove she didn't have a covenant with the devil? I can't even get my head around that. You might think it privately, but to go out in public as a politician and say that with a straight face is really actually scary. Like it's initially laughable, but then you think, but there must be people that think like he does, that do believe that's happening.
And they also really believed that for these women to have been accused of being witches, then they were for sure bad people anyways. So why exonerate someone who was a bad person?
Oh my God. You can't convict people just for being bad people. They actually need to break laws. Sorry.
What I would be interested in, I kind of remember he slightly rode back from that, didn't he? He was like, oh, I didn't mean witches were real. I mean, there needed to be some evidence. Like, yeah, whatever. You wanted proof. But there's a rise in the US, and I wondered if you'd considered this or will be considering it in the future. There's a rise of the pastors who are going viral for saying there's a witch in the community. There's a witch amongst us. I don't know if you saw the pastor who was talking about his wife, and they had a book club. And he was saying, my wife knows that I was speaking to her friends in the book club and there are newcomers to town. We know who they are. They're witches. It's like, oh my God, this is just like a playbook of how to find outsiders and start blaming them for problems in your community. Do you guys see the rise of these pastors, and is it a scary thing?
We're starting to collect data in general on the way we see crimes happening, accusations happening in the country, so that there's something to look at, because it's still it's like slippery to people. They don't realize how prevalent a lot of this stuff is in our country.
Yeah. And also, I think it's tied up with money as well, isn't it? Because churches obviously don't pay tax, so anybody can set up a church, and that's a way to get people in. It's really grabby, like it's a big story, and the supernatural is much more interesting than just straightforward. Just be nice to your neighbor. I think it's much more grabby to say, evil is abroad, and I'm the person that can save you from it. There's like a big hero thing going on as well there, I think.
Could we not start up another church? Does it need to be a religious church? I'm just thinking we could start up like
there is a religion in America that's not religious, isn't there? There's one that's, I can't remember what it's quite mainstream. We don't have it in the UK as far as I'm aware. And people get together and it's like in church, but it's not really religious. That's so vague. And you're both going, what are you on about? I will research this. I'll get back, because my sister-in-law, that's the church that she attended growing up. But it's not actually a religious church, but it's all the good stuff about religion. It's quite strange. Anyway, sorry, that's another one of the crazy things. Now, I'm aware we've only got about 5.5 minutes left. Can you tell us, and then we'll tell you, where are you up to with like your legal cases and that side of things?
With the Massachusetts Witch Hunt Justice Project, they'd run a 2-year session in their general court. So we're waiting for the 2025, asking people to sign a petition at change.org/witch trials. And then we're also working on getting a memorial built in Connecticut. And we've been tentatively given some approval to submit designs.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. That's so cool. And who will fund that? Is that the state, or do you have to fundraise for that?
We'll need to do a mixture of probably some state grants and maybe a bond issue and individual donations.
Because your system's quite different ours for that, isn't it, Claire?
Yeah, unfortunately. Can I also ask, can anyone sign the petition? Can our listeners sign the petition, or do they have to be in the US?
Anyone in the world can sign it.
Cool. We'll definitely share that then with our listeners as well.
Thank you.
Cool. Because we're at the stage now where we had a politician in the Scottish Parliament who was taking it forward, and they'd done a public consultation. And then that MSP, the Member of Scottish Parliament, was then promoted to the Cabinet. And the rules here are that if you're in the Cabinet, which is, I suppose, ostensibly you've got more power, they're not allowed to do that type of work anymore. So it kind of fell to nobody. So we're in the process. We've got a fantastic colleague who's beavering away trying to get somebody else to take that up just now. So she's looking into that. And I've heard today, Claire, that she's been told that the public consultation is going to be made available. It's going to be published within the next month. So we should have some news about that, which we'll do. And as soon as we have it, we'll put it out.
Brilliant. Yeah, it was going to be published, and we kept saying it's going to be published. We hear it's going to be published. And then Natalie Dawn, MSP, was unable to do it anymore. So it basically just sat there in abeyance. But thankfully, it's kicked back in and it's moving again now.
Yeah. And you know what it's like with politics? It's hard to get people involved in things that are happening right now. People are, I don't know about with you guys, but in the UK, people are pretty apathetic. So it's hard to get people involved. So when you're talking about something that happened hundreds of years ago, you've obviously got even more of an issue with that. But we're hoping that we will have an MSP that's going to pick it up and that we'll progress. Our memorial plans, we've got some ideas, but the problem that we have in Scotland is that the government have said to us, we're largely supportive, but we're also completely poor and can't give you any money for it. So that's more of a problem, because Claire and I 100% do not have time to fundraise. So that would have to be, I don't know how that would work, unless we just had a benefactor that went, here's £1 million. And then that would be...
Any benefactors listening? Any benefactors?
Never know.
Multi-millionaires. I mean, feel free.
Yeah, but that's where we're at there. But we still think it's incredibly important to have a memorial, presumably for the same reasons as you guys, but just so that it's marked, so that people can learn about it without realising that that even happened necessarily, if they would just came across the memorial and then learned about it through that. But also just because women's history just isn't marked, and sad to say, the witch hunts was mostly a story about women being treated terribly. There were obviously men too, but mostly women. So that's why we think it's important. But it's been really nice talking to you and actually connecting like this.
This was awesome.
You too.
Thank
you so much.
Yeah,
really
we've been watching you, Josh. I've been watching you on TikTok.
Oh,
whenever,
really?
But yeah, whenever it comes across, Zoe, take a leaf out of Josh's book.
Yeah. So I was trying to be
I'm not actually personally, although I joke, I'm not actually personally on TikTok much anymore. But if I occasionally switch it on, because I follow you, I think you come up in the feed and I listen to your TikToks. So
I'm a high school teacher, and if I did TikToks, it would be just horrendous. It'd be horrendous. It'd start in my class.
So people can follow you on TikTok as well, is what I'm saying, as well as all your social.
So I'm going to say goodbye, but it's more like an adieu, because I think we should do this again. So it'd be really nice to catch up again and get even more of a story. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Night.
Bye.
Bye.
Before we go, I'd like to clarify something that I said about Dorothy Good when we were talking to Claire and Zoe. I said that Dorothy Good never received a payout of compensation for her wrongful imprisonment, and that is true. However, I do realize that her father did petition for restitution, and he was awarded an amount for the death of Sarah Good, Dorothy's mother and his wife. He had that money sent to Benjamin Putnam, who was boarding Dorothy at the time in 1712 when the restitution was awarded. So Dorothy was living with this Benjamin Putnam, and William Good signed over the restitution to Benjamin Putnam. So presumably some of it was used for Dorothy's care, but given that she was indigent her entire life and relied on public support, I don't believe that she ever had any control over any of this money, and it was paid for her mother's suffering. There was not a payment specifically for Dorothy's suffering if you look at the receipt written by the clerk of the court. It refers specifically to Sarah as being the awardee of the money. For more on Dorothy Good's life, listen to Witch Hunt episode titled Rachel Christone on the Salem Witch Museum and the Life of Dorothy Good, which originally released July 20th, 2023.
Please join us on February 1st, 2025 at Hartford, Connecticut's Old State House at 1 p.m. for a free community history event, remembering the innocent victims of the Connecticut witch trials. It's a special 2-hour commemoration of those who lost their lives in colonial Connecticut's witch trials. Award-winning performers Deborah Walsh and Ginny Wolfe will open with a dramatic reading of The Last Night, followed by insights from the Connecticut Witch Trial Exoneration Project founders and renowned historians. We will honor the victims with a remembrance ceremony joined by State Representative Jane Garibay. Connect with fellow community members and witch trial history descendants afterward as we work together to build awareness for this crucial chapter of our history. Don't miss this powerful blend of performance, education, and commemoration that aligns with Connecticut's recent legislative recognition of these historical injustices.
Thank you for listening to Witch Hunt.
Join us next week.
If you liked what you've heard today, please subscribe to Witch Hunt wherever you get your podcasts.
Visit us at witchhuntshow.com for more great content.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.